Today in Bloomburrow, we get a Stormy Otter, a combo crow, and so much more. Let's break it down. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Bloomburrow spoilers. So we kick off week 2 of spoilers with some super wild cards, which means we should probably get right into it. Start talking new Bloomburrow cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can pre-order them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk some Bloomburrow. First up today, we get a new red mythic in Stormbreaker, and this card is kind of wild. So it is a 4-mana 1/4 Otter Wizard. It has haste, and it says whenever you cast the instant or sorcery spell, create a token that's a copy of Stormbreaker, exile that token at the beginning of your next end step. So we've never really seen a creature exactly like Stormbreaker before. We've seen creatures with literal storm in the past, a progenitor to a storm entity. Stormbreaker doesn't have actual storm. It's got like newfangled watered down storm where it only works with instants and sorceries, but essentially this is a storm for instant and sorceries. Make a token copy of this until end of turn. If you want to compare it to an actual storm card, it kind of reminds me a little bit of like Grape Shot mixed with Empty the Warrants. Of course, the difference here is you need to get Stormbreaker on the battlefield first. With the old Storm cards, you want to cast a ton of spells and then cast your Grape Shot or then cast your Empty of Warrants. Stormbreaker is exactly the opposite. You want to play Stormbreaker and then sling a bunch of instants and sorceries to make a ton of copies of it. And this card is ridiculously powerful if you can untap with it. So I think the thing people might miss about this card is how the tokens increase exponentially. So let's say you start with a single Stormbreaker, you cast a spell, you copy it, now you have 2 Stormbreakers, which means when you cast your next spell, both of them will trigger. So now you have 4 Stormbreakers. The next one you cast, you go up to 8, the next spell 16, then 32. What this means in practice is if you can play Stormbreaker and then cast 5 spells, that's all you need to cast, you will end up with 32 hasty Stormbreakers, which should be enough to kill your opponent on the spot by attacking with all these hasty 1/4 threats. So as far as where this card actually fits, obviously seems designed to work with the spell slingery storm theme of otters in standard. Now we have Stormbreaker to grow with Crustacean Mage, which deals damage when we cast non-creature spells, Harnesser of Storms to generate card advantage as we're casting non-creature spells, Valley Floodcaller gonna pump our team even more. We even need even less spells to win the game with our Stormbreakers, Braya to give prowess to our entire team. So it'll be interesting to see how this shakes out. My concern with Stormbreaker in standard, and I think this card is super powerful, but the challenge is you're probably gonna need to untap with it, right? We don't really have rituals in standard, so it's going to be very difficult to play a Stormbreaker and then follow up that same turn by casting enough spells to win with Stormbreaker. I guess you could in the late game if you get up to like 8 or 9 or 10 mana, but that seems like a challenge in and of itself. So the challenge is going to be, can you actually untap with this card? If you can play and untap with this in a deck build around it, you should be able to make enough copies to win the game. Of course, it does die to literally all the removal. Not only does it die to like go for the throats, but as a 1/4, it dies to cut down even, so it does die to everything. So it's going to be an interesting deck building challenge. I think the card is definitely playable in standard. It's just going to be hard to find the right deck to build around it. All you really got to do is play it and then sling a bunch of spells and you end up winning the game. We had a lot of cheap cantrips in standard, Might of the Meek, Splash Portal, new ones coming with Bloomburrow. You could even use like Ren's Resolve style effects. Plus, there's some other shenanigans for this card that we haven't really talked about. Artist Talent, another way to support this Storm plan just by reducing the cost of our non-creature spells, giving us some rummaging. But the less obvious plan is like Insidious Roots. Insidious Roots lets us tap creature tokens to make a mana of any color. I don't know how you mix all this together and get Insidious Roots in your Stormbreaker deck, but in theory, you cast a spell, you start making these token copies of Stormbreaker, and those tokens can immediately tap to add mana to let you cast more spells. So maybe that's the way that you could like win the game on the same turn you play Stormbreaker. If you get it to like 5 mana, you play the Stormbreaker, you already have the Insidious Roots down, so you cast a 1 mana cantrip, you get a token copy. Now this token copy taps to make a mana, cast another 1 mana cantrip. Now you get 2 token copies. Now you can tap them for 2 mana and just kind of snowball out of control that way. Also can kind of do the same thing with Balin. Balin, not as strong as Insidious Roots, because you only get to make 1 mana for every 2 tokens you tap, but still, I think there's ways to build around this card. This is one of the cards that has me most hyped to try to take the challenge of building around in Standard, because I think the end result, if you can find the right build for this card, is going to be pretty spectacular. I've seen people talking about playing this card in Modern, and I think those people are kind of insane. Like, okay, so I don't want to be too harsh on this, so let me say, the most obvious criticism of this card for Modern is that Modern Storm, especially the new versions that we've seen post Modern Horizons 3, they want to win the game on turn 2. Their goal is not to play this thing on turn 4 and then try to win the game on turn 5. They want to, like, ritual to Ral on turn 2 and win the game right then. So I think in general, this card is just too slow for Modern Storm, but I do think there might be an exception, and that exception is, I think it could be a reasonable Wish target. A lot of these Storm decks play Wish to grab finishers or answers out of their sideboard. I could see Stormbreaker being a one-of sideboard card, because one of the ways the main deck plan of the Storm deck kind of fizzles is something like Leyline of Sanctity, shutting down Grape Shot. So this might be a better Wish target out of the sideboard than something like Empty the Warrens, because Empty the Warrens, you make a ton of tokens, but they're going to have to wait a turn to attack because they're summoning sick. I can imagine you like start comboing with the Storm deck, and then you use Wish to get Stormbreaker, you cast a few more spells, you get all these hasty copies and win the game right away. So I think it could serve a purpose in Modern, but I don't think this is like a 4 of main deck Modern Storm card or anything like that. Same with Legacy, I think it's just too slow compared to the other options, but it could be an interesting Wish target for specific scenarios. Also worth mentioning, the card goes infinite super easily with Sprout Swarm. Sprout Swarm, this super weird old Future Sight card. 2 mana to make a 1/1 green Sapperling, but it has buyback of 3 and Convoke. So the idea would be, you can use Sprout Swarm with buyback for 5 total mana. Once you get going, every time you cast Sprout Swarm, you're going to be making more than 5 copies of Stormbreaker, so you can tap the green Sapperling token to pay for Sprout Swarm's green mana, tap 4 Stormbreaker tokens, and make a whole bunch of Stormbreakers. Then it goes back to your hand thanks to buyback, so you do it again. So you just make literally infinite copies of Stormbreaker and use that to win the game. So I think that that could be something that wouldn't really be competitive, but it would be a fun Commander deck or a Sweet Against the Odds deck. Speaking of Commander, I think this card is probably a new staple in Storm decks for sure, and maybe in Spellslinger decks too. It seems pretty easy because of how the tokens increase exponentially to just kill the entire table with this card the turn that you cast it or the turn after you cast it. And in Commander, you get all the good rituals and everything, but I imagine that what happens in Commander, remember we just talked about how 5 spells is going to give you 32 of these. The 6th spell is going to bump you up to 64. The 7th spell is going to be 128. The 8th spell, you're going to be close to, what, 260 or something? So it is going to be enough to kill the table pretty easily. You do not have to cast that many spells with this on the battlefield to be able to just wipe out everyone in a game of Commander. So if you want a finisher in your Stella Lee deck, or your Niv deck, or your Alsha deck, or your Burgi deck, or your Viren deck, I feel like Stormbreaker is now one of the best options in the format. Also, if you want to get cute, there are some weird end-step manipulation things you can do with this card. One is Sundial the Infinite. So the token copies that Stormbreaker makes go away end of turn. However, Sundial the Infinite can end the turn. So the trick here is, let's say you make a bunch of Stormbreakers, you go to your end step, they're all going to put a trigger on the stack saying exile me. With all those triggers on the stack, if you activate Sundial the Infinite and end your turn, you'll essentially fizzle all those triggers and be able to keep all your Stormbreakers forever. There's another even simpler trick, which is, let's say you make some Stormbreakers during your turn, and then you go to your end step and those copies are going to go away. You can cast an instant on your end step. The token that you make on the end step is going to stick around until the next end step. So that's a way that if you can keep chaining instants on the end step, you can kind of keep a bunch of these copies floating around forever. So Stormbreaker, the card's kind of wild. We'll see just how good it ends up being, but the ceiling of this card is incredibly high. It is going to lead to some ridiculous moments of just like hundreds or thousands of millions of damage being dealt in Standard, definitely in Commander, maybe even in some older formats. So I think Stormbreaker, one of the best Otters we have ever seen, and one of the cards from the set I am personally most hyped to build around. We also got a new mythic Elemental Snake in Rottenmouth Viper, play on on Cottonmouth Viper, I think. A 6-mana 6/6 elemental snake. It's a black card. It says an additional cost to cast this spell. You may sacrifice any number of non-land permanents. This spell costs 1 less to cast for each permanent sack this way. And then when it enters or attacks, you put a blight counter on it. And then for each blight counter on it, each opponent loses 4 life unless they discard a card or sack a non-land permanent. So Rottenmouth Viper, very interesting card. So at its ceiling, this can be a 1-mana 6/6 with a bunch of upsides. You would have to sack 5 non-land permanents to actually get its cost that low, but that's a pretty scary card, right? A super cheap big body that also has an ETB trigger and an attack trigger that's going to snowball throughout the game because you're going to keep getting these blight counters, so each attack is going to be more and more powerful. We've seen a few cards that are like sort of similar to this: Awaken the Blood Avatar, Torgar, Drago, but these cards are a little bit different. In general, they make you sacrifice creatures rather than any non-land permanent. Drago's exception, you can sack artifacts too, but you get a 2-mana discount for each one that you sacrifice. So to get a Awaken the Blood Avatar down to 2 mana, you just need to sack 3 things. Same with Drago or Torgar. Rottenmouth Viper, to get it down to 1 mana, you have to sack 5 things, but the upside is they don't have to be creatures, right? It's any non-land permanent, and then you're getting this Torment Hailfire effect stacked on it, which is pretty nice once it gets going. Obviously, it's not going to do the Torment thing of just winning the game right away because you can cast X for a huge amount, but as it keeps snowballing, it's going to get more and more powerful. I think the biggest upside of this card is working with tokens. So cards like Novice Inspector, Charming Scoundrel, Vine Reap Mentor, these are cheap creatures that also add a treasure or a clue or a food to the battlefield. These cards essentially reduce the cost of Cottonmouth Viper by 2. Your Novice Inspector can be sacked and the clue can be sacked, so it's pretty easy if you want to build around this to get on the battlefield relatively quickly. So I think that's one way to build around the deck, is just try to flood the board with these cheap, kind of underpowered permanents and tokens, and then get your Rottenmouth Viper on the battlefield super quick. Another place that's kind of intriguing is in a discard deck. I've been thinking about this more and more throughout spoiler season, ever since we saw Bandit's Talent to give us like a rack effect in standard, but maybe there's a mono black discard deck that can play like Tiny Bones Joins Up, Hopeless Nightmare. These are enchantments that do their damage when they enter the battlefield, so then sacrificing them later to Rottenmouth Viper is fine. Hostile Investigator makes clues you can sacrifice, so maybe we can have a mono black discard deck with this kind of being the top end of our curve, because it also can make your opponent discard cards, so it kind of works with the theme of the deck. My big question for this card, and the reason I'm not sure this card is actually that busted, is it does die to pretty much any removal spell, and as much as being able to sacrifice your own tokens to power it out is good, the way its ability is worded, each opponent loses 4 life unless they sack a non-land permanent or discards a card. It doesn't say non-token permanent there, so your opponent can sacrifice their useless tokens to kind of get around its ability. Just a vanilla 6/6 with the ETB and attack trigger, I don't know if that's really strong enough, so I'm a little concerned that this is going to be a card that incentivizes you to like sacrifice most of your board, and then your opponent's just like, okay, I'll sack a token and then go for the throw it, or I'll take 4 and then go for the throw it, and you're down a bunch of things that you sacrifice. Obviously, like we talked about before, you can minimize the downside by playing a bunch of token producers, so the things you're sacking aren't that powerful, but this still is a card that dies to removal. Yes, I know you do get the ETB trigger out of it, but if this is like sack some stuff, your opponent takes 4 and then dies to go for the throw, it's not that strong of a card. I've seen some people compare this to Sheoldred the Apocalypse, and I can kind of see why, because this is a card that snowballs every turn it's on the battlefield, right? We've seen Sheoldred be very, very strong because it just sits out there, and every turn it sits out, your opponent's losing life, you're gaining life, your opponent's losing life, you're gaining life. Rottenmouth Viper is kind of similar. Every turn that it sticks out, it's going to get more counters, which is going to make your opponent sack more stuff, discard more stuff, lose more life. I think one of the big downsides is you do have to attack with it. Sheoldred does its job even if you can't attack with it. A lot of times you just sit back on your Sheoldred, don't risk putting it into combat where your opponent might double block it or whatever, and you just know it's just going to keep draining and draining and draining. Rottenmouth Viper, it's got to attack for its trigger to work outside of the first turn that enters the battlefield, which means it's going to be a little harder on like a big cluttered board to actually keep snowballing its ability, because eventually it's probably going to trade off in combat even if it does dodge removal. In older formats, there are places that you could play this. It works well in sacrifice decks because you want to be sacking stuff anyway. We've seen seem like Asmore decks in Modern be really good at flooding the board with food. You could sack the food to get this on the battlefield on the cheap. Not that this is like a Modern staple or anything, but if you squint hard enough, you could see homes for this card. And I think the same is mostly true for Commander. In Commander, I think this is a card primarily for sack decks. In a sack deck like Korvald or Jury or Mazarek, sacrificing your stuff is kind of an upside because it's going to be triggering your commander. So in that scenario, Rottenmouth Viper's sack a bunch of stuff to get me on the battlefield ability might actually be a benefit rather than a drawback. So I think it could show up in those decks, plus its ability is worded that it hits each opponent with the blight counters, so it kind of scales really well for Commander. When you have 3 opponents that are going to have to be sacrificing or discarding or losing life, its ability gets more and more powerful. So Rottenmouth Viper, boy, I am really on the fence on this one. I feel like I can't make a really hard prediction about how good this card is going to be. My gut is it's like mid to like a little below mid as far as how strong it is. I think it could definitely see standard play, and it has uses, and I can see this ceiling in my head that's really high. We've talked before about how in 2024, Magic's about snowballing, and you want threats that keep getting better and better the longer they're on the battlefield, and Rottenmouth Viper is one of those cards. There are games, if your opponent doesn't have a removal spell, they can't deal with this in combat, you just play this, and over the course of 2 or 3 turns, it essentially just kills your opponent all by itself, by attacking and with its blight counter ability. But I also think there's going to be a lot of games where you like turbo this out, sack a bunch of stuff, and your opponent just goes for the throw day, and you kind of end up losing the game rather than winning the game. So my guess is this is one of those cards that has a super high ceiling, a super low floor. My fear is because it dies to removal and it has to attack to get its ability going every turn, my guess is it ends up being like kind of medium to a bit below, but we'll have to wait and see. I hope the card is good because it seems like a really cool design, and I'm hyped to build a discard deck around it. We also got a ridiculous new combo crow in Jackdaw Savior. So a 3-mana 3/1 white bird cleric, and as flying, it says whenever it or another creature you control with flying dies, return another target creature card with lesser mana value from your graveyard to the battlefield. So Jackdaw Savior, if it sounds kind of familiar, it's kind of like Aura's Skyclave Hierophant, except for flyers, and I think a lot better since it's cheaper and it has flying. Essentially, whenever one of your flyers dies, you get to reanimate another creature. This opens up some ridiculous value loops and even infinite combos, but I think this card is just really good. Like a 3-mana 3/1 flyer is already good stats, and then you get a powerful ability too. So I think level 1 of this card, which is probably how it'll see the most play in standard, is just playing it fairly in a deck with a bunch of flyers. In a deck with a bunch of flyers, this card's just great. Your opponent kills it, you get something back from the graveyard. If your opponent kills something else with flying, you get something else back from the graveyard. So even just played super fairly in a bird deck, in a flyer deck, this card offers removal protection, some grindy value. The same is even true outside of standard. Imagine like Pioneer Spirits, or you might remember in the past we've played some budget like favorable wins decks. Jackdaw Savior would be so perfect there. I don't know if you can play it in literal Spirits because it's a bird cleric and that would be kind of awkward, but imagine a deck like Spirits, but it's just generic flyers rather than build around a creature type. Jackdaw Savior would not just be good in that deck, it would arguably be one of the best cards in the deck, because if your opponent kills your stuff, you're just getting things back, this constant loop of value. So all this to say, just playing this fairly in a deck built around flying, really, really good. But it gets way more exciting once you start playing this card unfairly. So how do you play Jackdaw unfairly? So the first level is just play it with big evoke flyers. So for example, Null Drifter. Let's say you got a Null Drifter, a 7-mana flyer, except you can evoke it for 3 mana. If you get down a Jackdaw and then evoke a Null Drifter, not only are you going to draw a couple cards with Null Drifter, but you can reanimate anything up to 6 mana value from your graveyard for free, which is an absurdly good deal for just evoking a Null Drifter. And it's worth mentioning here, in case it's not clear, while Jackdaw only triggers when a flyer dies, it can reanimate non-flyers too. So you can get back anything from your graveyard as long as it meets the mana value restriction. Same is true of like Muldrifter, evoke a Muldrifter, reanimate a 4-drop, evoke a Vesper Lark, reanimate something with its ability and something with Jackdaw's ability. So it works really well with evoke flyers. It's also incredibly sweet with Luminous Broodmoth. So Luminous Broodmoth is this 4-drop 3/4 flyer that says when a creature you control without flying dies, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control with a flying counter on it. So this can do some really sweet loops where you like sacrifice a flyer to get a non-flyer back from the graveyard with Jackdaw's ability, but that non-flyer is now going to have flying thanks to Luminous Broodmoth's ability, and then you could sacrifice the now flying creature to get back something else from your graveyard. Thankfully, the way Wizards worded Jackdaw, where you have to return another target creature with lesser mana value, means you're not going to be able to set up any ability to like loop one creature, which would be very awkward. But with Luminous Broodmoth, you can generate a huge amount of value, a huge amount of death triggers, a huge amount of ETB triggers. Not a fully infinite combo though. It's not just gonna like win you the game on the spot, but it is gonna generate a ton of value. If you want to just go fully infinite, there's a couple ways of doing this. Super easy one, Saphiric's Daughter, and then a flyer. So like Inspiring Overseer, let's say. So the way this works, you can sack Saphiric's Daughter to make it so the next time target creature you control would be put in the graveyard from play this turn, you return the card to play. So you have your Saphi, you sack it targeting the Inspiring Overseer, and then you sack your Inspiring Overseer to a free sack outlet like Phyrexian Altar. So when the Inspiring Overseer dies, it is going to let you reanimate the Saphi thanks to Jackdaw, and then thanks to Saphi's ability, the Inspiring Overseer is going to come back into play. So you get both your creatures back, and you get death triggers, you get the ETB trigger from Inspiring Overseer. If you literally combo with Inspiring Overseer, you'll draw your entire deck, you'll gain a whole bunch of life. So that's a way you can go infinite. My favorite combo, though, is Jackdaw with Karmic Guide in Ashen Rider and a sack outlet. And this combo actually works with Karmic Guide, Jackdaw, in any flyer with mana value 6 or greater. You can loop it an infinite number of times. My favorite's Ashen Rider, though, because of how it actually plays out and what it does. So here's the idea. So you get on your Jackdaw, you play your Karmic Guide. When it enters the battlefield, you can reanimate a creature. So you reanimate the Ashen Rider. Ashen Rider, when it enters the battlefield or dies, you exile target permanent. So the Ashen Rider comes into play. You exile, let's say, one of your opponent's lands. And then you use your sack outlet. Could be any free sack outlet, but let's say Viscera's here. You sack the Karmic Guide. When it dies, you might be able to reanimate something, mana value 4 or less with Jackdaw, but you just need it in the graveyard, because then you're going to sacrifice the Ashen Rider. Ashen Rider dies, you exile another land. More importantly, it triggers Jackdaw. Since Ashen Rider costs 8 mana, you get to get back the Karmic Guide with Jackdaw's ability. The Karmic Guide gets back the Ashen Rider, exiles another land. So essentially, you can loop the Ashen Rider an infinite number of times and exile literally all of your opponent's permanents, including their lands. So that's the power of Jackdaw. And I gotta say, this is just one of the sweetest designs in the set. I think this card, like I said, can see fair play in Standard, where you just play it to grind out value in a deck full of flyers, and the combo potential this offers is absolutely off the charts. It is such a cool crow. We also got a new rabbit 1-drop in Pawpatch Recruiter. So a 1 mana 2/1 with Offspring of 2. So you get a 1/1 copy if you pay 2 extra mana. It has trample, and it says whenever a creature you control becomes a target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control other than that creature. So you can't put on the same creature that's targeted. That's fine though. So Pawpatch Recruiter, it's essentially a very souped up Savannah Lions. How far we have come since 1993, when Savannah Lions is just a vanilla 1 mana 2/1, was a pretty good aggro threat. Now our Savannah Lions have Offspring of 2, so they do a little baby making. They have trample. They grow as your things are targeted. It is kind of wild amount of power creep here. I think Pawpatch Recruiter, it's a solid card. Just being a Savannah Lions is not enough to see play anymore, but I think it synergizes enough with the rabbit plan of trying to go super wide, making tokens, that it probably will show up in rabbit aggro. It also synergizes pretty well with another uncommon 1-drop that we got today for rabbits in Seasoned Warrenguard. We'll talk about it more later, but it's a 1 mana 1/2, but if you have a token, it gets +2/+0 when it attacks, so we can attack as a 3/2. So we'll have to wait and see, but these cards combined with the rest of the rabbit support, I think, is kind of the foundation for Selesnya token rabbit aggro in Bloomburrow Standard. So Pawpatch Recruiter, I don't know if it's enough to see play in like a generic deck. It could show up in like mono green Stompy if that ends up being a thing, but I think in rabbits at least, it's gonna be a really good 1-drop. We also got a sweet new Orzhov enchantment in Lunar Convocation. So a white and a black for an enchantment that says, at the beginning of your end step, if you gain life this turn, each opponent loses 1 life. At the beginning of your end step, if you gained and lost life this turn, create a 1/1 black bat creature token with flying, and then you could pay 1 in a black and 2 life to draw a card. So if you think about what this card is, if you gain life you get a damage each turn on your opponents. I couldn't find a great comparison. Let's say Dogged Pursuit. Essentially, you're making each opponent lose life every turn cycle as long as you gain life. If you can gain and lose life each turn, you're essentially getting a Bitter Blossom, a better Bitter Blossom, since you're not losing life to the Bitter Blossom, but a 1/1 flyer each turn with a relevant creature type off of a 2-mana enchantment has historically been a very playable card. Of course, there's some hoops to jump through. You got to make sure that you can gain and lose life each turn, but I think if you build around it, it shouldn't be too bad. Plus, that last ability lets you lose life if you want to draw a card. That last ability is essentially Argo's Bloodfast, which did see playback when it was in Standard. So I think that when you add all this together, there's a lot of text on this enchantment, and a lot of it is very powerful text. So I think Lunar Convocation, not going to be good enough for every deck. I guess, like, you could just play as Argo's Bloodfast to generate card advantage, like out of the sideboard in any deck, but I think you really want to turn on that Bitter Blossom mode. You need to build a deck where you're gaining and losing life on each of your turns, and then this card is very, very good. Thankfully, losing life, super easy. We still got the Pain Lands in Standard, so you should be able to just do this with your mana base. So that means all you got to do is gain life, which I guess means it could be good in Soul Sisters, but really, I think it's designed to be a bat card. Bats are kind of designed to gain a bunch of life. There's like Bat Soul Sister and Life Creed Duo. Deep Cavern Bat has life. Like Zoraline can let you gain life and lose life each turn with its ability if you spend some mana, so we can turn on Lunar Convocation all by itself, which I think is what they're going for. Lunar Convocation into Zoraline, and then you can pay 2 life and a couple of mana to its abilities and reanimate something, and then make another Bat token, which will then gain you more life with the Zoraline in the future. You could even just do it with like Sheoldred and other life gain effects. It doesn't have to be a Bat card. So I think this card in a life gain deck, or in a deck that can incidentally gain life like bats, has potential to be really, really good since Pain Lands are still in Standard. And then in Commander, I think you can play this in any life gain deck, and then just trust that your fetch lands and your shock lands and your pain lands are going to let you lose life each turn to turn it on. And in Commander, Argo's Bloodfast isn't that bad. Like, pay 2 and 2 life to draw a card, especially in a deck that can gain life, is actually a perfectly fine effect. So I'd play it in like Sorin, Aloro. It's probably at its best though in Lisa Shroud of Dusk, because Lisa lets you pay life. Whenever a player casts a spell, they lose 2 life. So anytime you cast a spell, you're going to lose life, but it's also a big life linker. So when it gets in combat damage, it gains life. So Lisa kind of all by itself is going to be turning on your Lunar Convocation. Plus in Commander, when you start at 40 life, being able to pay 2 and some life to draw cards, really, really powerful effect. So Lunar Convocation, I really like this card. I think this card is very powerful, but its power mostly is focused on a pretty narrow archetype. So if you can build your deck in a way that turns it on, you're going to be rewarded with a very strong enchantment, like a better Bitter Blossom in Standard, but it's going to take some deck building work to actually turn it on, and those are my favorite kind of cards. In the world of lower rarity cards, got a few that deserve a shout out, starting with Thought-Stalker Warlock. So a 3-mana 2/2 Lizard Warlock, so close to being a Lizard Wizard, has Menace, and then it says whenever it enters, choose target opponent. If they lost life this turn, they reveal their hand. You choose a non-land card from it, they discard the card, otherwise they discard a card. So essentially, 3-mana Thoughtseize on a stick if your opponent lost life, otherwise your opponent still has to discard a card. So this reminds me a little bit of like Biting Palm Ninja, a card that I was pretty high on when Kamigawa came out, and it turned out that ninjas just weren't good enough, so Biting Palm Ninja wasn't good enough. This is much easier. You don't gotta ninjutsu, you don't gotta get in combat damage. All you gotta do with this is be playing a deck that's aggro enough to deal some damage to your opponent, and this just ETB Thoughtseizes your opponent, which is actually a really strong effect. And it's not like a Deep Cavern Bat or something where once it dies the card comes back. That card is just discarded forever. So I think in a deck that can turn it on, that's a pretty powerful effect, but I'm even more excited about that because we can see the pieces coming together for a full-on discard deck. Now that we have Thought-Stalker Warlock on top of like Tiny Bones joins up, Hopeless Nightmare, Hostile Investigator, Bandit's Talent to be our rack effect, I think we actually have the pieces to build literal mono black discard in Standard, which I'm really, really excited for. Also, very cute with Delny. Streetwise look at Panamaticon effects. Like, if you can play a Delny into this, you kind of scam, right? You're getting 2 Thought Seizes on a body. It's kind of like standard Grief almost. You're not doing it on turn 1, it's going to be like on turn 4 or something, but still, it's kind of the standard version of the Grief scam plan. So I think Thought-Stalker Warlock actually has a lot of implications, even though it's just an uncommon. We also got Seasoned Warrenguard. We mentioned this before. Pretty good rabbit 1-drop. 1 mana 1/2. Whenever it attacks while you control a token, it gets +2/+0 until end of turn, so it'll be 3/2. And we talked about rabbits just being all about tokens, right? You can play this into Carrot Cake to make a rabbit token, then attack on turn 2 for 3. There's Hop to it, there's Season in the Burrow. So because rabbits are all about making tokens, I think it fits there. The other place this might fit is the Boros Convoke deck is looking for a replacement to Vordaer and Epicure, which is rotating. Season Warrenguard isn't exactly the same. It's not going to make a blood token to sacrifice to Gleeful Demolition, so you're not going to get that synergy, but it is a 1-drop that works well with the token theme of Boros Convoke, and it just makes a big body that's going to get in a lot of damage. Remember, like, this works with any token. It doesn't say creature token, so if you play this and follow it up with Novice Inspector to make a clue token, that's going to be enough to turn it into a 3/2 attacker. So I think Season Warrenguard, the 1-drops in the set are actually kind of surprisingly strong. We also got a common aura in War Squeak. 1 red mana, enchant creature. When it enters, target creature and opponent controls can't block this turn. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has haste. This is worth calling out just because it's literally a reskinned Hammerhand. Exactly the same card in Hammerhand. Now, this was almost a decade ago now, but Hammerhand was actually played in decks back during its life in Standard. It triggered Heroic, it was played in mono red, so I think that War Squeak, especially since we have Valiant in Standard, which cares about targeting your own creatures to get value out of them, I think it might have a chance. Not saying it's a staple or anything, but it's close enough to a playable card that it's worth keeping in mind if you're trying to be aggro and get in a bunch of damage and you need to target your own creatures with things. War Squeak might actually be one of the cards that gets that done. We also got Bushy Bodyguard, which is worth shouting out just because it can make a lot of stats. So it's a 2 mana 2/1 with Offspring of 2, and it says when it enters, you can forage, so exile 3 cards from your graveyard or sack a food. If you do put 2 +1/+1 counters on it. So if you think about it, if you can play this and forage, it's a 2 mana 4/3. If you can do it twice and pay the Offspring, you get a 3/3 to go alongside it. So this is a card that I think you kind of get a build around. If this is just a 2 mana 2/1, totally unplayable. But if you can build a deck that turns this on turn 2, and you get a 4/3 on turn 2, that seems like a playable card. So you're looking for stuff like Stitcher Supplier, 1-drop, mills 3 cards. That's just enough that you can forage on turn 2 with Bushy Bodyguard. We got Candy Trail, which happens to be a 1 mana food, ETBs you scry to, and then Bushy Bodyguard comes down and you sack it and you get a 4/3 on turn 2. So have to wait and see. I don't know if there's enough support to make this work in Standard, and in Modern, a 4/3 for 2 is not as exciting as it is in Standard. But keep it in mind, if you can find a way to consistently turn this on early in the game and make it a 4/3, it's actually pretty far above the curve. Of course, we also got a bunch of draft chaff just to round things out today, which you can check out over on MTGPreviews.com. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Bloomburrow spoilers for today, and this set just keeps getting better and better. There were so many strong cards today. Let me know which one's your favorite. What do you think about our Otter Storm? Can that actually work in Standard? Can it work in Modern? All the other cards, let me know what you think about those as well. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be back tomorrow with even more Bloomburrow spoilers. So until then, have an amazing day, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? Well, you can find Saturday's spoiler video here, or maybe check out the Mucha Brew where we did some Trinispheric in Modern.